issue which our speakers will be addressing, which we'll be discussing, is framed as a question. How committed is the West to rooting out the sources of terrorism? It could not be more topical today. The Prime Minister David Cameron's speech yesterday has put the policy questions at the centre of the news agenda and the British government's own priorities, both in domestic affairs and in foreign policy. So if I have not mentioned that she is the daughter of the distinguished journalist and pioneer TV reporter in Afghanistan, Sandy Gul, it is because she has amassed an impressive CV of her own. Carlotta Gul.
Thank you for inviting me to speak here. Zahid and Aisha are both great friends from years of working in Pakistan, so that's a great pleasure to be on the same panel. As you heard, I've been a foreign correspondent, mostly a war correspondent, for the last 20 years, the last 16 of them for the New York Times. And I've come from way back looking at Islamism, violent Islamism, and terrorism right from early on. Even before I was a newspaper reporter, I was in Peshawar and came across in the refugee camps and in the aid circles that were looking after Afghan refugees. I saw some of these Arab fighters coming out from Afghanistan, and it was my first confrontation with a very, very hostile element of people who cared about the Afghans, who were involved in helping them in resisting the Russian invasion, but had a very, very different view from us, who were Western aid workers and journalists who were looking at the problem. And it was the first time I was spat at full in the face by someone, and that was my first encounter with what we called in those days Wahhabis. Now, bin Laden was actually there at that time in Peshawar. This was the late 80s, early 90s. And then I became a journalist, and I was working in Russia and went down to Chechnya. And I was reporting extensively on the first war there. As you know, the Chechens were asking for self-determination and independence from the Russians. And then we saw some Arabs turn up. And it was the same thing, very, very hostile to Westerners, very secretive about what they were doing. They were there to help fight. So I've followed this for years. So when 9/11 happened, I remember watching it in a hotel bar in Macedonia and telling people, I think it's bin Laden. So I've come from way back on this whole thing. But when 9/11 happened and I was working for an American paper, New York Times, of course I wanted to go back to Afghanistan and report it. And I ended up spending 10 years following the whole thing because it was, I felt, so important. It was where 9/11, the attacks of 9/11 came from, were thought up and were organized. But much more I saw something very damaging for a country that I'd come to know well, which was an emirate that wanted really such totalitarian control of the Afghans that it was frightening. And I think what we saw in the Taliban regime in Afghanistan was a forerunner of ISIS today. It's very similar. The whole way of running the emirate, the whole way of terrifying people, of indoctrinating young people, it's so similar. So just briefly, I wanted to tell you about the theme of my book, which I called The Wrong Enemy, because I think it explains a lot of where the West has gone wrong on Afghanistan and perhaps is not tackling things right today. I covered the whole war, so I saw the Taliban defeated in 2001. I then saw them resurge. They were completely gone from the country for 2 years. And then we started to see them coming back. There started being insurgent attacks. Taliban sighted in places. They started doing sabotage, bombs. It grew and grew until by 2008-9, they were close to Kabul, surrounding Kabul, and toppling the whole regime and upending the whole American operation there. And then we had the surge. Petraeus came in with a surge and pushed it back. And I think gave the Afghan government a chance again to hold on and to create a better society and keep the Taliban at bay. So that's what I was watching. And in 2006, I went to Quetta in Pakistan. It's down near the border, southern border of Afghanistan. And I was looking for Taliban, and I was looking for families of suicide bombers who'd been blowing themselves up in Afghanistan. And we traced it back to Pakistan. Anyway, I did a few days of reporting, and then I was in my hotel room, and I got raided by secret police. They burst into the hotel room. They beat me up. They took all my equipment, all my notebooks, my telephones, and they arrested the photographer who was working with me. And one of the things they said, I got quite angry. I guess I was alarmed. They actually punched me in the face, and I fell over on the coffee table and smashed everything. And when I angrily remonstrated with them what they were doing, they said, you're not allowed to go to Pashtunabad, which is a part of Quetta where a lot of Taliban were living, and you're not allowed to interview Taliban. And it summed up everything about the war. The Pakistanis were supporting the Taliban, they were allowing them sanctuary, they were living and running the whole Taliban insurgency from Quetta, and they didn't want reporters reporting on it. And a lot of Pakistani journalists knew much more than me, but they could never report on it. And in fact, after that incident, people who'd collaborated with me were told never to work with the New York Times again. They were told never to work with foreign journalists. Foreign journalists were dissuaded from traveling to Quetta. It was what happens, and is little written about in Pakistan, that journalists are told not to touch certain subjects, and this was one. It was the Pakistanis, and Pakistani intelligence, but Pakistani military running the Taliban insurgency against the Western mission operation in Afghanistan, and for their own reasons. And for years, this was never reported. It was difficult for a reporter like me to find the facts. But that incident really consolidated in my brain, and I went on to keep reporting and eventually exposed that the ISI was not only running the Taliban and supporting and funding them and directing them, but he was also collaborating with Al-Qaeda, and they were hiding bin Laden, who, as you all know, was found in Abbottabad in a house in Pakistan, just 100 yards away from the top military academy. And eventually I exposed that he was not only protected, but he was being handled by Pakistani intelligence as a sort of asset, as an intelligence asset. He was under a sort of protective custody. He wasn't very mobile, but he was able to meet and liaise with his commanders and his people. So he was still running Al-Qaeda from a safe house in Pakistan with the knowledge of their top intelligence agency. So what this whole decade of reporting there told me was that we were fighting the wrong enemy. When I say we, the NATO alliance, the Western alliance of US and British troops and many other nations, we were fighting Afghans in the villages, in the mountains. And we were always fighting serious battles and killing a lot of insurgents, but we never got to the crux of the matter and to the source of the problem, which was across the border in Pakistan. And they had training camps, they had recruiting mechanisms, they had funding coming in from all over the world. But and we never tackled that, and our governments never really openly confronted that. And as a journalist, of course, that began to really grate against me. But it was really also appalling to have to watch a war and report on so many casualties on all sides when our governments weren't really coming clean about where the problem was really coming from. And I think to this day, our governments haven't tackled the real problem that in Pakistan there is still sympathy, selective support of groups, and a double game, essentially. So that was the conclusion of my book. I am now working in Tunisia in North Africa, and I would say that one of the biggest lessons from the Pakistan experience was that Afghanistan in the 90s was left alone to be run by militias and have lots of extremist groups training, recruiting, and operating very freely. It was really neglected, Afghanistan, in the 90s, which led to 9/11 attacks. Today, the same is happening in Libya. When I look at Libya, it's very similar to Afghanistan in the 90s. Or you might say Waziristan, the part of the tribal areas of Pakistan, in these last decade, because that's where Al-Qaeda and these militant groups were free, they were left alone, they were given sanctuary, and they created a great deal of damage by running camps, training people, recruiting more and more, and recruiting foreign fighters from all over the world. They are now, some of them have gone to join ISIS, some of them have gone to Libya, where they're operating. The Tunisians who were in Al-Qaeda are today in Libya now, and they're starting to attack Tunisia, their homeland, and they want an emirate across the whole of the North Africa. And it sounds a crazy idea, but it's what the Taliban did, it's what ISIS did. It's totally possible if we don't really look at what's happening, look at the sources, and look at the facility that they have when they have a lawless country like Libya.
My experiences are different. I've been living in Northern Ireland since 1966. So I've seen, in a way, divided society, strife, and at the end, learning the lesson that just use of force on either side, whether it was Republicans or British Army, doesn't give you long-term solutions. And I think the problem that we are facing in the Middle East and rest of the world, it's kind of global, whether you call it, I call it Third World War. The definition is slightly different than what we know about First World War and Second World War. But it is World War. It is sadly coming one section of society, this Islamic world, not that all Muslims are bad, I don't mean that. And it is again affecting all the world. So my only suggestion is that it should be considered by all the governments of the world as a common problem, because it affects us all. So there should be a greater emphasis and a concerted plan how to deal with this problem that we have, because we know doing piecemeal, it's not going to go away. When 9/11 happened, I was in Belfast. I was hosting an event, and I remarked to one of my friends, top civil servants from here who were there at that time, that it's probably beginning of a 20-year war. Sadly, it looks like that. Probably it'll last even longer if we don't deal it in a concerted, collective way on a global stand. Thank you.
I thought I'm going to talk about what is not fashionable, which is radicalism. I mean, people hate to talk about radicalism. People like to talk about, states like to engage with counterterrorism, with terrorism, not with radicalism. I mean, today what's fashionable is ISIL or ISIS. In fact, I was talking to a journalist friend from Pakistan. He said that, it's very bad, but we are getting less and less funds, in Pakistan to research on other groups. The money from the West is actually going into wherever you have ISIS and ISIL. And this is tricky. Then what it means is that people would perhaps want to invest in ISIS and ISIL in any place. I mean, you want to remain part of the larger context. So suddenly you have ISIL popping up when it's not. And my other problem is that South Asia, which has a variety of groups, once you start talking about ISIS and ISIL, then nobody even wants to look at it. But much more important is nobody then looks at radicalism. I mean, remember, what draws attention towards a problem like radicalism is actually violence. And the absence of it, suddenly people, start to look the other way. So if people are not dying, then you don't care. I mean, there is an undercurrent. I mean, like oceans can be silent, but they're, there are underneath currents which are very troubling, which can change the weather, which can change the weather patterns and so much more. And that is what radicalism is like. It draws, it drives. It is the main driver which societies and states don't want to understand. I mean, for example, how can you do counterterrorism when you actually allow militant groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba or Jamaat-ud-Dawa or Jaish-e-Mohammed to actually go out and almost completely dominate the public domain? You have media covering them, they're doing welfare activities, they are into, I mean, if you look at, I mean, again, West and East are connected. I mean, if you look at social media, the presence, while the focus is immediately on ISIS and ISIL and blocking them, I mean, Twitter, Facebook, many other mediums are full of these other groups, engaging with the youth, talking to them. What is anybody doing about that? And unless we actually underscore and underline the fact that it's radicalism which is a problem, unless we do that, I don't think that even the terrorism problem will be solved in the long term.
South Asia report. There were some copies in the entrance. I'm not sure whether everyone managed to get one, but these are the main points relevant to our discussion. So I will be briefly going over the challenge, the debate, the approach, and the future. So the challenge, as we've discussed, and the speakers here have discussed already, is that the security situation in South Asia is very complex. Our report has profiled 16 terrorist groups in South Asia. Focus falls on Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan, and the effects that the Islamic State's growing power has on other terrorist organizations dominating the region, mainly Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Jihadist networks in South Asia are profiled using our militant map. That's on page 29 for anyone who does have access to the report, illustrating the relationship between terrorist groups and their splinters. The debate. In terms of policy recommendations for the West, after all, this talk is entitled, "What Can the West Do?" One of the main causes for radicalization in the region is disillusionment with the state, due to a number of internal problems: high levels of corruption, poverty, poor health services, lack of secular education, as has been discussed, unemployment, and so on. All of these make benefits offered by some terrorist groups, which I will discuss later, such as higher salaries, tempting. Recommendations for India involve building upon its already established cooperation with the United States, as well as higher engagement with the Muslim population. In Afghanistan, there have been some successes in disarmament programs, but they alone will not create long-term security. The country must take measures to offer a sustainable form of positive reconciliation and tackle the opium trade, which has hampered many internal and international efforts to counter terrorist financing. In Pakistan, efforts should go into fighting corruption and initiating judicial reform to link what we've suggested, formal and informal justice systems, to ensure proportionate punishments and faster trials, while at the same time working to improve the prison system and counter the appeal of madrasas by focusing on civic education, on being a citizen, pluralism, and freedom of religion. My second point looks at responses from these states themselves. It is very important to discuss the West's role in countering terrorism and extremism, but what are India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan doing themselves to counter these extremist threats, particularly the growing threat of the Islamic State? In light of recent events, governments within South Asia have responded differently. India banned the Islamic State in December 2014. Pakistan has ignored the presence of the Islamic State, even though roughly 300 fighters have left Pakistan to join ISIS. To put this in perspective, roughly 700 fighters have gone from the United Kingdom to support or fight for jihadist organizations in Syria and Iraq, about half of which have supposedly returned to Britain. Yet Pakistan's policy towards Islamic State has been drastically different from that of Britain. I mean, in Britain, the media will talk about the Islamic State every single day, almost, and in Pakistan, the approach has been very different, and yet we're looking at the same number of fighters, roughly. Recently, the Afghan Taliban has reportedly coordinated efforts with Iran against the threat of Islamic State in Afghanistan. The attraction of new movements such as Islamic State is based on the absence of credible leaders such as Mullah Omar, which we can discuss in the question and answer session if anyone wants me to discuss that further. Why does this affect policymakers in Britain? 43.4% of Muslims in Britain are of British Asian descent, making issues in India and Pakistan of particular importance to large segments of the British population. Moreover, £405 million of Britain's annual aid budget goes to Pakistan, of a total £12 billion in foreign aid from Britain. 178 million of this goes to Afghanistan, and we must keep in mind that UK will end financial aid to India this year. Sure, yeah. It's 405 million to Pakistan, 178 million to Afghanistan, none to India, and that's out of a budget of £12 billion. So I think I'm getting to, where am I, the future. Okay, the West's role. Due to time, I know we're running quite late. What I would suggest, pages 35 to 47 of the report, they talk about specific policy recommendations that we have suggested within India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and for the West, for aid for these countries. I will not go into these, but I do discuss mental health, prisons, the justice system, schools, and the opium trade. I'm going to just briefly discuss responses, the West's role. There's a strong correlation between poverty and susceptibility to extremist narratives in some countries. In that we mean corruption undermines the ability for individuals to cross the barrier of poverty. For some in South Asia, the IS wage of $400 per month is attractive. To put this in perspective, India's mean monthly income is $124. Afghanistan's is $55. Pakistan's is $106. And Jammu and Kashmir's is $43. That's compared to $400. However, even well-off and well-educated youth can be attracted to jihadist causes due to a sense of injustice and frustrated expectations, which, like South Asia, is the case in the UK and elsewhere as well. Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, LEJ, a potential Islamic State ally, is known for having a significant number of university graduates among its fighters. In certain countries, such as Pakistan, there is a negative correlation between poverty and support of terrorism. That is, elites find that some of their interests align with terrorist organizations, such as the annexation of Jammu and Kashmir. And unlike the poor, they are not exposed to the violent implications of their decisions. Hence, we have the case of a negative externality. So in our report, we advocate track to diplomacy, dialogue by non-state actors, to encourage groups of influential elites to think in cooperative ways. That's focusing on religious inconsistencies in terrorist rhetoric and the role of terrorists in the killing of civilians. These two things need to be highlighted more when it comes to discussions between different actors and non-state actors. For the role of the West, we suggest education, training, and job search assistance be extended to tackle economic and labor inactivity in South Asia, which links back to my point earlier about wage. Counter-extremism narratives, which one could argue is a contested term in itself, but they should be presented in local languages such as Urdu, other vernacular languages, highlighting the true cost of terrorism, so that sympathizers of all economic classes know that terrorist groups do not provide social benefits and exaggerate the provision of these benefits. I'm wondering, how much time do I have left? 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Okay, so since I have 3 minutes left, I will just briefly discuss two of the policy implications, which are mental health and prisons. Mental health. We suggest that government funding should focus on undertaking public health research initiatives to investigate and understand the causes and consequences of violence. This is a very new area in academia. It's only now being touched on. So the implications in policy are the WHO Violence Prevention Alliance has recently provided a public health framework which examines the public health impact of terrorist acts arising from violent radicalization. In that we mean direct consequences such as deaths, physical injuries, psychological and mental trauma. These public health frameworks should be implemented in South Asia, and the findings of the implications of radicalization and terrorism should be publicized. Current public health frameworks focus on individual, relationship, community, and society-centered approaches to prevent violence. We strongly urge governments to use social development, therapeutic, and treatment programs to focus on people at risk of harming themselves and others. That is, use a group format to address issues such as anger management or drug abuse. Why does this matter? It links us to public health and criminal justice. WHO's Violence Prevention Alliance programs focus on relationship skills, family therapy, parenting, home visitation, and mentoring. The Center for Disease Control in the United States uses similar approaches. These have positive, long-term effects in reducing violent and delinquent behavior. Extending such work to monitor and tackle violent radicalization and terrorism is a natural next step, but it has not been done yet. I will briefly talk about prisons. Recent large-scale terrorist attacks against the Pakistani state have motivated the Pakistani government to increase its campaign against terrorism, focusing on the use of military courts to speed up terrorism trials and accelerate the executions of those convicted. This approach has been largely ineffective in combating terrorism. Pakistan has more than 8,000 prisoners on death row, most of whom have exhausted the appeals process. The court system is slow, there is a heavy reliance on witness testimony, and little protection for judges and prosecutors. In Pakistan, 92,000 prisoners share 41,000 prison places. And juvenile and adult, as well as minor and hardened or politically motivated criminals, are mixed. There are few staff, there is frequent mistreatment and torture. Therefore, state support and recognition of traditional justice is recommended, because prisons can act as a place of networking for terrorists, not just places of rehabilitation.